The unscheduled goodbye. The makeup artist noticed it first. Johnny Carson's hands, usually steady as he adjusted his tie in the dressing room mirror, were moving slower than normal. It was 20 minutes before airtime on a Thursday in October 1983, and Dean Martin was scheduled to appear. Just another guest on just another night, except for the way Johnny kept glancing at the call sheet, then looking away, as if the paper itself carried weight. No one in the studio knew this would be the last time. Not the crew adjusting the lights, not the audience filing into their seats, not even Dean Martin himself, standing in the green room with a rocks glass that never seemed to empty or fill. These things have a way of hiding in plain sight, dressed up as ordinary evenings, until years later when someone watches the tape and sees what was always there. Carson had built his career on control. 30 minutes every weeknight, sometimes an hour, where he decided when to laugh, when to pause, when to let silence do the work that words couldn't. He had perfected the art of the reaction shot, the raised eyebrow that could make or break a comedian's career, the smile that looked effortless but was calibrated down to the second. But control is just another word for fear when you strip away the studio lights and the applause signs. Dean Martin had been coming on The Tonight Show since the beginning, back when the set was different and the desk was a different color and America was a different country. They had a rhythm, the two of them. Dean would shuffle out, always slightly loose, always carrying the suggestion of a buzz, even when he was stone sober, and Johnny would play the straight man with a wink. The audience loved it because it felt real, which was the greatest trick of all. Making performance look like friendship, and friendship look like performance until no one could tell the difference. The stage manager gave the 5-minute warning. Johnny stood up from his chair, smoothed down his jacket, and walked toward the curtain. He passed by a monitor showing Dean in the green room, and for just a moment he stopped. Dean was staring at nothing in particular, his famous half-smile nowhere to be seen. He looked tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from a long day, but the kind that lives in the bones, that shows up in photographs even when you're laughing. Ed McMahon was already at his station, warming up the crowd with the ease of a man who had done this thousands of times. Doc Severinsen and the band were running through the opening number. Everything was in place, all the pieces arranged exactly as they should be. But Johnny had learned something over the years. The moments that matter most are never the ones you plan for. They're the ones that happen in the spaces between, in the commercial breaks, in the seconds after the camera cuts away. The show began the way it always did. The music, the applause, Johnny's entrance through the curtain with that familiar wave and smile. The monologue landed well, a few jokes about Reagan, something about the weather, the kind of material that would be forgotten by morning but served its purpose in the moment. This was the contract. He would show up and make them laugh, and they would show up and let him. When it came time to introduce Dean, Johnny's voice carried its usual warmth, but there was something else underneath it, something the audience wouldn't catch but Dean would. They had known each other too long for secrets. Dean walked out to applause and took his seat, and for the first few minutes, everything proceeded according to script. They talked about Dean's upcoming shows in Vegas, about golf, about nothing in particular. The kind of conversation that fills time and asks nothing of anyone. But then Dean said something that changed the temperature in the room. He mentioned a mutual friend who had died 6 months earlier, a comedian whose name most people had forgotten, but who had meant something to both of them back when they were all young and hungry and stupid enough to think success would feel different than it did. Johnny nodded, and the audience, sensing a shift, grew quieter. This wasn't part of the show they had paid to see. Dean kept talking, his words coming slower now, about how strange it was to outlive people, to be the one still standing when others had fallen away. He wasn't crying, wasn't even particularly sad, just stating facts the way someone might comment on the weather. But Johnny heard what wasn't being said. He heard the exhaustion, the weight of playing Dean Martin for so long that the real person underneath had become a stranger even to himself. The commercial break came, and the moment the red light on the camera went dark, Dean turned to Johnny and asked a question that had been waiting for years to be asked. He asked if Johnny ever got tired. Not physically tired, but tired of being the person everyone expected him to be. Tired of the smile, the suit, the competence. Tired of being Johnny Carson. The studio was still buzzing with crew members adjusting equipment and audience members talking among themselves, but in that small pocket of space between the host's desk and the guest's chair, there was only silence. Johnny looked at Dean, really looked at him, and saw his own reflection staring back. Two men who had built careers out of seeming effortless, who had turned personality into product, who had given so much of themselves to the camera that they sometimes forgot what was left when the camera turned away. Johnny didn't answer the question directly. He never did. Instead, he told a story about the first time he hosted the show, back in 1962, when he was so nervous he could barely hold the cards steady. He talked about how he used to think that if he did it long enough, it would start to feel natural, like something he was instead of something he did. But it never stopped feeling like a performance, even when it was real, especially when it was real. Dean listened without interrupting, his glass resting forgotten on the armrest of his chair. Around them, the stage manager was counting down to the return from commercial. 30 seconds. 20. But neither of them moved to adjust their posture or prepare their faces for the camera. For just those few seconds, they weren't a host and a guest. They were two people having a conversation that couldn't be sold to sponsors or edited for time. When the cameras came back on, something had shifted. The audience probably didn't notice, or if they did, they likely attributed it to the earlier mention of their dead friend. But the conversation that followed was different from the thousands that had come before. Johnny and Dean stopped performing friendship and started having one. They talked about fear, about legacy, about what it means to be remembered for something you're not sure you ever really were. Dean mentioned his son who had died in a plane crash 2 years earlier. His voice didn't break when he said it, but it didn't have to. The fact of it hung in the air like smoke. Johnny had sent flowers, had called, had done all the things you're supposed to do when someone you know loses a child. But they had never talked about it, not really. There had never been time or space or permission. Now, with millions of people watching, Dean was talking about how grief doesn't follow the rules people expect it to. How it shows up at strange times, in the middle of a poker game or during a sound check. How it makes everything feel both more real and less real at the same time. Johnny listened the way he listened to guests when they were telling the truth instead of selling something, with his full attention, without already planning his next question. The interview ran long. The producers were signaling from the booth to wrap it up, to get to the next segment, but Johnny waved them off. Some things mattered more than the schedule. When they finally did cut to commercial, and the show moved on to its next segment, Johnny and Dean shook hands. It was a simple gesture, something they had done hundreds of times before, but this time Dean held on a moment longer than necessary, and Johnny understood that this was the goodbye they were pretending it wasn't. Dean never came back to The Tonight Show after that night. He made a few more appearances on other programs, gave a few more performances in Vegas, but he never sat in that chair across from Johnny again. There was no announcement, no explanation, no formal farewell. He simply stopped showing up, the way people do when they've said everything they need to say. Johnny continued hosting for nearly another decade, night after night, finding new guests and new jokes and new ways to fill the same familiar space. But he kept a photograph from that October episode in his office, not from the interview itself, but from the commercial break, taken by a crew member who happened to have a camera handy. In the photograph, Johnny and Dean are both looking off to the side, at something outside the frame, their faces unguarded, in a way they never were when the red light was on. Years later, after Johnny had retired and Dean had died, a reporter asked Johnny about his favorite guests, the ones who had mattered most. He mentioned the big names, the icons, the people you would expect him to mention. But then he grew quiet and said that sometimes the best conversations were the ones that happened when everyone thought they were just filling time. The ones where people forgot to perform and remembered to be human. The truth is that most of life happens in the commercial breaks, in the moments between the moments people think matter. The Tonight Show was 90 minutes of programming 4 nights a week, but it was also 23 years of invisible accumulations, of small recognitions passing between people who had chosen to live their lives in public. Johnny and Dean understood something that audiences rarely see, that intimacy on television is almost always an illusion, except for the rare occasions when it isn't, when two people find themselves accidentally being real in front of millions of witnesses. That October night in 1983 was one of those occasions. Not because anything dramatic happened, not because anyone cried or confessed or broke down, but because two men who had spent their lives being exactly who everyone expected them to be took a few minutes to acknowledge the cost of that expectation. They didn't solve anything or resolve anything, or even particularly change anything. They just stopped pretending briefly that the performance didn't hurt. In the archive footage, if you watch closely, you can see the moment it happens. It's there in the way Johnny's smile falters for just a fraction of a second when Dean mentions his son. It's there in the way Dean's hand trembles slightly as he reaches for his glass. It's there in the silence that stretches a beat too long between them. The kind of silence that would normally be edited out, but wasn't, because sometimes the silence is the point. The audience that night went home thinking they had seen just another episode of The Tonight Show. They had laughed at the jokes, applauded at the right moments, filed out of the studio and back into their lives without knowing they had witnessed something rare. But that's how these things work. The moments that crack you open don't announce themselves. They arrive disguised as ordinary time, and only later, when you're alone with your thoughts, do you realize you've been changed. Johnny Carson spent 3 decades mastering the art of the perfect exit, knowing exactly when to end a bit, when to cut to commercial, when to bring the show to a close. But he never quite figured out how to say goodbye to the people who mattered. Not to his writers when they moved on to other shows, not to Ed McMahon when the end finally came, and not to Dean Martin on that October night when they both knew but couldn't say that this was the last time. Maybe that's the real skill, though. Not the perfect exit, but the ability to let things end without needing them to be perfect. To understand that some goodbyes happen in the middle of sentences, that some doors close so quietly you don't hear them until years later when you reach for a handle that's no longer there. Dean Martin died on Christmas morning in 1995, alone in his home, having largely withdrawn from public life in his final years. Johnny sent flowers but didn't attend the funeral. He never explained why, but people who knew him understood. He had already said goodbye, years earlier, in the only way he knew how, by sitting across from a friend and acknowledging without words that they were both tired of being who they were supposed to be. The Tonight Show continued without Dean, just as it eventually continued without Johnny. The desk is still there, in a different studio with a different host, and guests still sit in that chair and tell their stories. But the particular alchemy that happened between Johnny and Dean, the specific frequency of understanding that came from two people who had lived parallel lives in the public eye, that's gone now. It existed only in those accumulated hours, those thousands of conversations that added up to something that looked like friendship, and mostly was. There's a moment near the end of that final interview, just before they cut to commercial for the last time, where Dean looks directly at Johnny and says thank you. Not for the invitation to be on the show, not for the career opportunities or the laughs or any of the professional courtesies. Just thank you, plain and simple, for reasons that didn't need to be explained because they both already knew. Johnny nodded, said something light to deflect the weight of the moment, and then the cameras cut away. But in that nod was an entire conversation, a recognition of everything they had been to each other and everything they couldn't be. It was an acknowledgment that they had both survived something together, this strange life of being famous, of being watched, of turning yourself into a product that people consumed and then forgot about until the next episode. The studio audience applauded as Dean stood up to leave, and Johnny rose to shake his hand one more time. The band played him off, the way they played off every guest. and Dean walked back through the curtain and out of the studio, and though no one knew it then, out of the Tonight Show forever. In the years that followed, Johnny would occasionally mention Dean in interviews, always fondly, always with that slightly distant tone he used when talking about the past. He never talked about that final appearance specifically, never pointed to it as significant or meaningful. Maybe because he knew that the moments that matter most lose something when you explain them. They exist best in memory, in the space between what was said and what was understood. The truth is that Johnny Carson said goodbye to a lot of people over the course of his career. He said goodbye to guests and staff and band leaders and audiences. He said goodbye to versions of himself, to the young, nervous host he had been, to the middle-aged king of late night, eventually to the institution he had built. But the goodbye to Dean Martin was different, not because it was more important or more emotional, but because it was real in a way that television rarely allows things to be real. They were both old enough by then to know that time doesn't wait for perfect moments, that sometimes you get one chance to say what needs to be said, and if you miss it, it's gone. They were both practiced enough in the art of performance to know when to drop it, when to let the masks fall, and just be two tired men talking about how hard it is to be human when everyone's watching. The episode aired, the reviews were fine, no one wrote think pieces about the depth of the conversation or the subtext of the silences. It was filed away in the archive, along with thousands of other episodes, just another night in the endless procession of nights that made up The Tonight Show. But for the people who were there, in the studio, watching it happen in real time, there was a sense that something had shifted, that they had been permitted to witness something private happening in public. And maybe that's the paradox at the heart of all of this. Johnny Carson and Dean Martin were two of the most public figures of their era, their faces known to millions, their voices piped into living rooms across America. But the realest moment they shared happened in front of all those people, not despite the audience, but almost because of it. The camera gave them permission to be vulnerable in a way they might never have been in private, because performance and truth aren't always opposites. Sometimes they're the same thing, arriving from different directions. The last time Johnny mentioned Dean publicly was in an interview years after he had retired from The Tonight Show. The interviewer asked about regrets, and Johnny sat quietly for a moment before saying that he wished he had been better at keeping in touch with people, at maintaining the relationships that mattered. He didn't mention Dean by name, but the sadness in his voice suggested he didn't need to. That's how these stories end, not with resolution, but with the quiet acknowledgement of what was lost along the way. Two men who knew each other for decades, who shared stages and audiences and the strange burden of fame, and in the end, they couldn't quite figure out how to be friends when the cameras weren't rolling. Or maybe they were always friends, and the cameras were just the excuse they needed to admit it. The studio where they filmed that last interview has been torn down and rebuilt a dozen times. The footage exists in an archive somewhere, accessible to anyone with an internet connection, those 90 minutes condensed into clips and highlights. But the feeling of being there, of watching it happen, of sensing that something was ending even if you couldn't name what it was, that's gone. You can't archive the weight of a moment, the way it sits in your chest and stays there. Johnny Carson died in 2005, having lived the last years of his life in almost complete privacy. He gave no farewell tours, no final interviews, no retrospectives on his career. He simply stepped away, the way Dean had stepped away from his chair that October night, and let the rest of the world figure out what to make of his absence. And maybe that's the real goodbye, not the one that happens on camera, but the one that happens after, when you realize that the person you thought you knew was always partly a performance, and the performance you thought you understood was always partly real. Johnny and Dean both knew this, had lived it every day of their professional lives. They knew that the best you can hope for is a few moments of genuine connection in between all the artifice. And if you're lucky, those moments happen when someone's watching, so there's proof that they existed at all. The last frame of that interview shows Johnny at his desk, watching Dean walk off stage. His expression is unreadable, which was always his greatest talent. He could be feeling everything or nothing, saying goodbye or just marking time until the next segment. The camera holds on him for just a second longer than necessary, and then it cuts away and the show goes on. Because the show always goes on, until suddenly it doesn't, and you're left with nothing but the memory of what it felt like when it did.